The friendship Hollywood didn't know about, Nicole Kidman's tribute to Sam Neill. On the 13th of July 2026, the acting world lost a man who had spent more than 5 decades quietly becoming one of its most beloved figures. Sam Neill, the New Zealand actor best known to millions as paleontologist Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, died in Sydney, Australia at St. Vincent's Private Hospital. He was 78. His family's statement, posted to his social media account, described the loss as sudden and unexpected, and it added one detail that made the timing almost impossible for fans to process. Sam Neill was cancer-free when he died. Just weeks earlier, he had stood in front of a camera looking healthier and happier than he had in years, talking about the future as though he finally had won again. That contrast between a man celebrating survival and a man gone within months is the reason this story has stayed in headlines for weeks. And at the center of the tributes that followed, one voice carried a different kind of weight than the rest. Nicole Kidman, who had known Sam Neill since she was 18 years old, didn't just mourn a colleague. She described losing someone who had shaped the entire course of her career before the world even knew her name. To understand why her words landed the way they did, it helps to go back to where their story actually began, long before either of them were household names. In 1989, a virtually unknown 18-year-old actress from Sydney was cast in a tense psychological thriller called Dead Calm. The film, directed by Philip Noyce, told the story of a young married couple whose ocean voyage is disrupted when a dangerous stranger boards their boat in the middle of open water. Kidman played the wife, a role that demanded she carry enormous emotional weight in nearly every scene, opposite a co-star, Sam Neill, who was already an established name in the New Zealand and Australian film industries. He had spent more than a decade building a reputation in art house dramas most American audiences had never heard of, including his breakout in Roger Donaldson's 1977 film Sleeping Dogs, a movie credited with reviving New Zealand's film industry after a long dormant stretch. By the time Dead Calm went into production, Neill was the veteran on set, and Kidman was the newcomer whose entire career could have gone either way depending on how that film performed. What made the difference for her, according to what she has said in the years since, wasn't a single scene or a single piece of advice. It was the way Neill treated her presence on that set as something that mattered. He didn't hover as a distant mentor offering notes between takes. He made a teenager on her first major film feel like she genuinely belonged there. That kind of quiet protectiveness doesn't always show up in interviews or behind-the-scenes footage, but it tends to shape how a young actor understands the industry for the rest of their career. Dead Calm went on to become a critical success and helped launch Kidman toward the international career that eventually included an Academy Award. Neill, for his part, continued building the kind of resume that would later include Jurassic Park, The Piano, Peaky Blinders, and Hunt for the Wilderpeople. But the friendship the two of them formed on that boat set in 1989 didn't fade the way so many film set relationships do once the cameras stop rolling and the actors scatter toward their next projects. 3 decades later, in 2019, Kidman and Neill found themselves together again, this time on a panel for Big Little Lies alongside Laura Dern. By then, their paths had crossed often enough across different projects and different decades that reporters treated the reunion as a natural continuation of an old friendship rather than a rare industry event worth dissecting. That kind of casual familiarity, the sense that two people who worked together once in 1989 were still simply friends 30 years later, is exactly what made Kidman's statement after his death feel so different from the standard tributes that circulate whenever a public figure passes away. Within hours of the news breaking, Kidman released a statement to the Sydney Morning Herald describing herself as immensely saddened by what had happened. She called Sam one of the greats and said being around him was a joy. She explained that they met when she was just 18, that he took her under his wing, and that they stayed friends for the rest of his life. She described him as charming, kind, funny, and intelligent, and said he would be greatly missed, extending her sympathy to his family. It is a short statement, only a few sentences, but it carries the weight of 37 years of friendship behind every word, the kind of loyalty that doesn't require constant contact to remain genuine. In the weeks that followed, Kidman and her Big Little Lies co-star Laura Dern were photographed together raising a glass of 2 Paddocks Pinot Noir, the wine Neill had produced from the Central Otago vineyard he founded in 1993. Dern captioned the photo as a toast to their beloved friend and leading man, calling it the way he would have wanted to be remembered, with a glass of his own wine rather than a somber ceremony. Kidman was far from alone in describing him that way. Across dozens of tributes from people who had worked with him in completely different decades and completely different corners of the industry, the same words kept appearing. Kind, warm, generous, funny. Steven Spielberg, who directed Neill as Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, called him exceptionally collaborative and noted the strange contrast between how warm and fatherly Neill was off-camera compared to the character he played, a paleontologist famously irritated by children. Cillian Murphy, his Peaky Blinders co-star, said he admired and adored Neill in equal measure, describing him as one of the kindest, funniest and gentlest people he had ever worked with. Toni Collette, who worked alongside him on 2 separate films years apart, wrote on her Instagram that he was the most beautiful, decent gentleman she had ever known, a big-hearted man with a dry, hilarious wit. Karl Urban, a fellow New Zealand actor, called him an inspiration for an entire generation of performers who followed his trailblazing path into an industry that barely existed as an international presence when Neill first started out in the 1970s. Even political leaders weighed in, an unusual honor for an actor whose earliest work came from a film industry with almost no global visibility at the time. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, posted that Neill was one of the greats, someone who had spent more than 50 years carrying New Zealand's stories to the rest of the world and helping build the country's film industry into what it eventually became. What almost none of those tributes led with was Jurassic Park, despite it being the role that introduced him to the widest possible audience. Instead, nearly every person who spoke publicly focused on the same handful of qualities: his humor, his loyalty, and the way he made the people around him feel valued. That pattern, repeated by people who had never met each other and worked with Neill decades apart, is part of why his death resonated so widely across an industry not always known for that kind of consistency. To understand why that consistency mattered so much, it's worth looking at what Sam Neill had actually been dealing with in the years leading up to his death, much of which he chose to share publicly rather than hide from view. Neill first revealed his cancer diagnosis to the public in his 2023 memoir, titled Did I Ever Tell You This? In the book, he described being diagnosed with stage 3 angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, a rare and aggressive form of blood cancer, after noticing swollen glands while promoting Jurassic World Dominion in March of 2022. He wrote candidly about the disorientation of the diagnosis, describing how within days of noticing something felt wrong, he was lying in a hospital bed with chemicals draining into his system meant to kill the cancer that only days earlier, he hadn't even known he had. He underwent 4 rounds of chemotherapy, and in interviews around the memoir's release, he admitted that the treatment stripped him of what he called any kind of dignity, describing the process as brutal. For a while, that treatment worked well enough to put him into remission, and he spoke to outlets including the BBC about being alive and well, joking that headlines repeating the word cancer over and over had become tiresome given how good he actually felt. But the remission didn't last. At some point, the chemotherapy that had been managing his cancer stopped working altogether. In an interview he gave in April of 2026, just months before his death, Neill described that period in stark terms, saying he felt he was at a loss and that it looked like he was on the way out, a situation he called far from ideal. That kind of directness, the willingness to describe himself as standing on the edge of a cliff rather than softening the language for public consumption, was consistent with how he had discussed his illness from the very beginning. Rather than disappear from public life to manage a declining prognosis privately, he stayed visible, kept talking to journalists, and kept working on projects that mattered to him, including an environmental documentary he released in early 2026 opposing a proposed industrial gold mine near his winery in New Zealand. What ultimately changed his trajectory was a treatment called CAR T-cell therapy, a relatively new approach that works by genetically modifying a patient's own blood cells so the immune system can recognize and attack cancer more precisely than traditional chemotherapy allows. The treatment, which had become increasingly accessible in Australia in recent years, is credited by Neill himself with saving his life. By April of 2026, he was sitting in front of an Australian television camera telling reporters that a recent scan had come back completely clear. He described the news as an extraordinary thing and said he was very, very excited that this kind of recovery could even happen. He talked openly about wanting more time, mentioning his grandchildren and the terraces and olive trees he had planted at his winery, things he wanted to be around long enough to see mature. He had also said, in earlier interviews discussing his illness, that he wasn't remotely afraid of dying, though he found the idea of it deeply annoying given how much he still wanted to do. Those comments, made with the kind of dry humor that defined nearly every interview he gave, read very differently once people revisited them in the days after his death. 2 months after that hopeful scan, Sam Neill died in Sydney. His family's statement made a point of noting that he remained cancer-free at the time of his death, a detail that only made the loss feel more disorienting to everyone who had just watched him celebrate beating the disease. No official cause of death was included in that first family statement, which led to a wave of speculation and, according to his longtime agent Philip Grentz, a number of inaccurate reports in the days that followed. In mid-July, Grentz released a statement identifying pneumonia as the cause of death, explaining that he was sharing the information specifically to put an end to what he called outright falsehoods circulating in some corners of the media. Neill's family, Grentz added, planned to hold a private memorial at his farm in New Zealand rather than any kind of public ceremony, in keeping with what he described as Neill's own preference for privacy despite his very public career. The family's original statement had also thanked the staff at St. Vincent's Private Hospital by name for what they called the incredible care Neill received in his final hours, a detail that reflected how the family wanted the story to end, with gratitude rather than public speculation about what had gone wrong so quickly after such encouraging news. Neill was born Nigel John Dermot Neill in Northern Ireland in 1947 before his family moved to Christchurch, New Zealand, when he was a child, where he adopted the name Sam at school. Over a career spanning more than 50 years, he built one of the more unusual filmographies in modern cinema, moving between prestige drama and blockbuster franchise work without ever fully settling into one category. He played a submarine officer in The Hunt for Red October, a grieving husband opposite Holly Hunter in Jane Campion's Oscar-winning film The Piano, the corrupt Chief Inspector Chester Campbell in Peaky Blinders, and a gruff but endearing uncle in Taika Waititi's Hunt for the Wilder People, a role many of his fellow New Zealanders consider among his most personally cherished performances. He was knighted in New Zealand in 2022 for his contributions to film, and he spent much of his life away from film sets tending to two paddocks, the Central Otago winery he founded in 1993, a project connected to a family wine trade that traced back to his ancestors' arrival in New Zealand in 1861. Those who knew him often mentioned his habit of naming farm animals after his Hollywood friends, a detail that made its way into nearly every profile written about him in his final years and became one of the small human touches people kept returning to in the days after his death. Australian comedian Magda Szubanski, a close friend after whom Neill had once named one of his ducks, said she had spoken with him not long before he died and that he sounded cancer-free, genuinely happy, and excited about everything still ahead of him. That account lines up precisely with the hopeful tone of his April interview and is part of why the abruptness of his death has been so difficult for the people who knew him best to reconcile. A man who spent 5 years being unusually open about a brutal illness, who fought his way back from a point where his own doctors weren't sure he'd survive, and who spent his final public months talking about grandchildren, olive trees and one more film role, was gone within weeks of finally getting the news he had been waiting years to hear. The Jurassic Park cast, in particular, treated the loss as something closer to losing a family member than a former colleague. Jeff Goldblum, who starred alongside Neill across multiple films in the franchise, posted a tribute on social media describing him as heading into the next great adventure and promising he would be loved always and forever. Laura Dern, who had known Neill since the original 1993 film, told Entertainment Weekly that he was her beloved lifetime friend, someone who showed her real depths of loyalty, protectiveness, and love, always delivered with what she called his trademark dry wit. Kidman herself later added that she had adored making all of the Jurassic films alongside Neill, Dern, and Goldblum, and that the four of them would always share what she referred to as their Jurassic family, a bond she said would keep him from ever being forgotten by them or by the millions of fans who grew up watching the franchise. Alec Baldwin, who worked with Neill decades earlier on The Hunt for Red October, said he had always hoped the two of them would work together again someday, a sentiment echoed by director Colin Trevorrow, who called Neill a deeply soulful man and said it isn't every lifetime that a person gets to befriend someone who would later be remembered as a legend. Director Rachel Griffiths, who worked with Neill both early and late in her career, said she planned to open a bottle from his own winery that same night simply to mark the loss properly, a gesture that echoed the one Kidman and Dern would later share publicly. Peaky Blinders co-star Joe Cole kept his tribute brief, writing simply that he hoped his friend would rest in peace, while Neill's fellow New Zealand actor Carl Urban went further, calling him a national treasure who had given so much to both his home country and the world. What stood out across nearly all of these tributes, regardless of which decade or which project connected the two people involved, was how rarely anyone mentioned professional accolades at all. Actors who had shared a single film with him decades earlier and easily could have let the memory fade into a footnote instead took the time to post something personal, often specific enough that it clearly wasn't handed to them by a publicist. That kind of consistency, repeated across a career spanning 5 continents worth of film industries and more than 50 years of work, doesn't happen by accident. It reflects a pattern that people who worked with Neill seem to notice independently of one another, without ever comparing notes, which is part of why the tributes felt less like a coordinated industry response and more like a genuine, spontaneous outpouring from people who had each experienced the same version of him. That is ultimately what makes Nicole Kidman's tribute resonate the way it does. It isn't built around Jurassic Park or box office numbers or industry accolades. It's built around a memory of an 18-year-old actress on her first major film set, and a co-star who decided, without any particular reason that she was worth looking out for. Nearly 4 decades later, that same quality, the instinct to make the people around him feel like they belonged, is what an entire industry chose to remember him for all at once, and almost entirely in his own words repeated back through the people who knew him.